Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this episode of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. Uh, my name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm very pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. We're talking about a very interesting macro geopolitical dynamic today about China and its positionality in the world. It finds itself increasingly, as you point out, Brunello, in this week's newsletter, it finds itself between these two major policies. One, it's sort of charm offensive in various parts of the developing world, but including the West. But two, it's support for Russia, or sort of lukewarm support for Russia during the war in Ukraine. And today we're going to explore how China has been reconciling, but also balancing these two different priorities. But maybe first it's worth starting off with a change that we've spoken about before in sort of Chinese foreign policy. Qin Gang, who was a former ambassador to Washington, has now been made foreign minister, I think, as of the end of last year, replacing Wang Yi, who's in the position for over a decade. Brunello, what's your analysis of that situation? What sort of direction does that point to?
So a few weeks ago, when we spoke about these changes in Beijing, we asked ourselves whether China was ready for the U-turning policy beyond the zero COVID policy changes that we saw coming. And there was definitely some opening on the business side, so the part becoming slightly more business friendly after the witch hunting of the last few, I would say, years now, especially in the tech sector, and also on Russia. So we know that on the 4th of February 2022, Xi Jinping and Putin met in Beijing. They signed a joint declaration. They signed a sort of limitless cooperation between the two countries. But then we saw what happened after that, the invasion of Ukraine, a nasty war that seems endless at this point, with NATO being directly and indirectly more and more involved, sending weapons to Ukraine and so on. Well, what signal Beijing sent to the world? First, they changed the foreign minister, as you said. Wang Yi was substituted by Xi Gang. But when he did not disappear, actually was promoted to some extent to the Politburo and became the director of Central Foreign Affairs Commission, so the highest ranking diplomat effectively in China. And he has started a tour in Europe. He went to France first, then went to Italy, and then to Germany at the Munich Security Conference. And it was a sort of charm offensive to convince Europeans that China is still open for business. And China itself realized that it was too early to totally decouple from the West. The other message that one wanted to say is that China is open to a diplomatic solution for Ukraine. And this is where I think the situation gets even more complicated.
Right. And this charm offensive, I mean, this obviously isn't the first major move as part of it. It's something that's been going on for years. And now we're seeing it more and more in the West in a more sort of explicit way, but we've seen it in the past in more subtle ways through things like trade and investment in parts of the developing world, particularly in Central Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa. Tell me more about this and sort of the BRI project that sort of encompasses all of this. But also, why is China pivoting towards this sort of developing world?
So China believes that in the next 50 years, which is more or less the policy horizon, and that makes a difference compared to the West. It's always fighting the next local elections 2, 3 months down the line. In the next 50 years, by far the fastest growing part of the world, and perhaps the largest in terms of population for sure, would be Southeast Asia and to some extent Africa. So this is where they realize that they need to pivot their attention to also to get rid of some of the excess capacity that they have in terms of both capital and labor, and be redeployed abroad. That's somehow the meaning of the BRI initiative. But this is a long-term process. It takes time. As I said, 20, 30 year project just to begin, and then it needs to deploy over time. And so the war in Ukraine has actually accelerated this decoupling from US and Europe. But US and Europe are still by far the largest customers of China in terms of importing their products. So we cannot decouple fast. And so coming back with the message that China is open for business is clearly welcome, but is also obvious. It was way too early for China to say, sorry guys, I don't need you anymore. I'm going to deal with the eastern part of the world the way the US and Europe see it. So China, India at some point, Southeast Asia, Africa, and of course the entire Russian subcontinent, so to speak. So the entire eastern part of the hemisphere, um, they want to focus on way too early.
Right. And we've heard this sort of quite interesting relationship that it has with Russia during the war. And it was, in the starting, it was this sort of key player. Would it take a side? Would it be ambiguous? And it continues to sort of operate in this weird strategic ambiguity. But in your newsletter, you point out to some really interesting statistics of trade and military cooperation. Tell us a bit more about this, and to what degree has China actually supported Russia on the ground in Ukraine?
Yeah, so China might be coming around with the kind of suggesting that they are ready to start a diplomatic solution to the war in Ukraine, and they are not going to follow Russia to the full extent. However, the statistics that you quoted exactly point in a different direction. First of all, China has helped Russia to circumvent most of the sanctions that have been imposed. We've spoken about the payment system, for example. But it's not just that. The increase in imports from Russia, from China to Russia in the last year in terms of manufactured goods, commodities, technology, and so on, has been enormous. The trade between the two countries increased by 27 billions and has touched 100 billions in total. And Russia is even becoming more dependent on Chinese import. And for example, the import of foreign-made semiconductors has increased by 34% in 2022 alone. And again, the lion's shares of these coming from China. So to some extent, China might be saying that they are not siding or fully supporting Russia, but in reality, statistics prove otherwise.
Yeah. And then how did these sort of two kind of different, patterns of foreign policy that we've spoken about in different parts of the world, how do you think they reconcile with each other? Do you think they'll ever sort of conflict, and what sort of preliminary conclusions can we draw?
So in the letter, we kind of highlighted there are some preliminary conclusions that can be drawn. First of all, it's definitely good things that China has realized that some of its headline policies have been damaging. Zero COVID being one, but also the unconditional support to Russia and the war in Ukraine clearly need to be revisited. The second conclusion is that a good thing is saying words, another thing is though proving things with facts. So you can say that you're not supporting Russia, but then if you help circumvent the sanctions, if you instead continue providing technology for dual use, military and civilian, to Russia, including on semiconductors, if you continue importing commodities from Russia, you're actually providing support. And third, what we really want to say is that even if at some point Russia is convinced by China in somehow stopping in one way or the other this war, unfortunately, in our opinion, this Cold War between US and China, besides this episode, this proxy war, the way we called it, is unfortunately, in our opinion, meant to last, because this is something geostrategic, something long term, is something that will accompany us for effectively the rest of our lives. But then there's a question of speed, there's a question of intensity. It might be a Cold War, but it can be a fast Cold War, then very intense. It can be a slow growing, not very intense Cold War. Okay, these are two different scenarios. So anything that goes in the direction of something slightly slower, less intense, is definitely good news. So let's not disregard the good news of what's going on, of one tour in Europe and so on, but also let's be realistic of what can be actually achieved on the ground.
Yeah. No, I mean it's very important to be both, sort of optimistic, cautiously optimistic. But more than that, I really do like your focus on, the material situation on the ground, the trade, the investment, the military cooperation, and things like critical minerals, which really I think many people have ignored or been able to ignore for many years, but they, form the bedrock of modern technology in every way. And it's sort of trade, which is largely controlled by China, will dictate so much of US China, Russia China, and global relations. So it's a situation we'll continue to watch, possibly for years. But as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.